Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Erskine Bowles, co-chair, along with my pal Hank Paulson of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, and we're delighted you all could join us this morning. The theme of today's event is the same as the title of a book that many of you have in front of you today, Maintaining the Strength of American Capitalism. From my vantage point, the theme couldn't be more timely or more controversial. I believe the future of the American form of capitalism is one of the most important questions facing our country today. There are two assumptions that we have that underline this theme and our book. The first is that American capitalism should not be abandoned, and the second is that our current economic policies must be adapted, modified, reformed, so that our center system works for more people, a lot more people. This is why we are here today, to think together about the specific reforms that would strengthen our system of capitalism and allow more American workers and families to more fully benefit from it. You know, I've spent the best part of the last 10 years on American college campuses, so I'm rarely surprised by anything anymore. But I must admit, a recent Gallup poll worried me quite a bit. I know most of you have seen it. It showed fewer than half of young Americans are even positive about capitalism, while some 51% have positive attitudes about socialism. For an old capitalist like me, that's pretty worrisome, and it conveys the urgency of the questions that we are going to discuss this morning. It also is a reminder that we better not take for granted the institutions and systems that have propelled centuries of economic prosperity. Now, what I personally, and this is just me, worry about the most is the sustainability of a system that yields such large economic disparities. It strikes me as unjust and, yes, immoral that in an era of such prosperity, 500,000 people in this country experience homelessness on any given night, and 1 in 6 kids, children, experience food insecurity. I am also deeply troubled by the fact that the American dream appears to be dead for millions and millions of American kids who are born today into low and middle income families. I can't count the number of parents who told me when I was at the university or traveling to other universities that they could live with the fact that their own lives may not be better than those of their parents, but they couldn't live with the fact that their kids' lives may not be better than theirs, that their kids may not get a real shot at the American dream. It just seemed to them and to me that the lucky gene pool is too big a factor in outcomes today. Lastly, I am concerned that ensuring that our markets are the most competitive in the world and whether our competition policies are keeping up with market dynamics. So I believe it behooves us to take a hard look at the outcomes that our system of capitalism is producing and see what can be done to improve these outcomes for more people. And again, I want to stress for a lot more people. To this end, we have decided to focus today's events around 3 topics. First, we'll hear about the causes and consequences, pros and cons, costs and benefits of recent trends in market concentration across many American industries. Second, we'll have a discussion about the strategic investments we should be making to promote economic fairness, mobility, and opportunity, and we will discuss the fiscal constraints that bind these policies. In this regard, we will discuss new ideas that relate to tax reform, entitlement reform, increased revenue and spending, and weigh these ideas against other alternative approaches. And we will close with a fireside chat with Ray Dalio and Hank Paulson about the evolution of American capitalism. Finally, before I turn the podium over to Hank, I'd like to reemphasize that today's event coincides with the release of a book you have in front of you. Our group is putting out this book to advance evidence-based policy proposals that are part of today's debate. I should stress that the book features different and sometimes opposing viewpoints, not all of which represent my own views or those of Hank or the other members of the Economic Strategy Group. We are proud of this book and the rigorous fact-based policy analysis that it features by leading experts, some of which are with us this morning. We invite you to take a copy of the book with you today and distribute as many as you want to others that you know. I should also add that the opinions you will hear discussed today by our panelists are those of the speakers themselves and not in all cases those of the members of our group. However, our group always tries to bring together experts we can learn from and debate with, experts from across disciplines, experiences, and political lines, and in today's case, speakers who offer a unique and diverse perspective on how we can make capitalism work for more people. And now, without further ado, let me turn the podium over to my good friend and co-chair, Hank Paulson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erskine, and thank you all for joining us here this morning. As Erskine said, we chose today's theme because many of the features of our nation's capitalist economy are being criticized with renewed vigor, and the basic assumptions that underpin our system are being called into question. Some say that our system is rigged for the elite, that free markets and free trade offer a bad deal for most Americans. Others argue that our system can't adequately deal with problems like climate change and rising inequality. Even a proud capitalist like me worries about the dynamism of a system that appears to be increasingly concentrated and the effects this is having on wages, competition, and consumer choice. I believe reforms are necessary and our economic model needs to be adjusted. And, all of the members of our Aspen Economic Strategy Group have agreed that more people need to participate in our economic success. So the debate over how to strengthen and update American capitalism is healthy and essential. But we need to do a better job of defining the problem and clarifying the facts. Today, we have a great lineup of speakers and I want to thank all of our speakers for being here today. Thank them for their time and for their contributions. Thank you to Thomas Pipillon, Nancy Rose, Chris Hughes, Damon Jones, and Jim Tankersley for lending us their expertise today. And thank you to the following members of the Economic Strategy Group who will be joining today's panels: Melissa Kearney, Doug Holtz-Eakin, Greg Ip, Bob Rubin, and Ray Dalio. Finally, I want to thank all of the members of the Economic Strategy Group who are here with us today, as well as those who couldn't make it, for their contributions and for their work. Now, please join me in welcoming our first panel today. Thank you.
I guess it's okay. I'll sit down over here, I guess. Thanks. Jason Furman couldn't make it, and Doug Holtz-Eakin will be taking his place on the panel. He should be here in a few minutes. We're just going to get started now. The topic is causes, consequences, and responses to market concentration. We have a couple of excellent panelists. Nancy Rose is one of the country's leading economic experts on antitrust issues. She was chief economist for antitrust at the Department of Justice in the end of the Obama presidency. She's now head of the economics department at MIT. We're very fortunate to have her here. Thomas Philippon teaches at New York University. He has just written a book which is getting very well received in such modest publications as the Wall Street Journal. It's called The Great Reversal, and it's a fascinating study looking at trends in market concentration in the United States versus other countries. Just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I think that the last time America went through a period of soul searching about the nature of capitalism was probably at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, with the growth of the very big corporate trusts that gave rise to the passage and then the vigorous enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and culminating in 1911 with the breakup of Standard Oil. We've come to call this the progressive era. And I kind of feel like we might be on the cusp of another sort of progressive era, because we're going through many of the similar economic trends and questions about corporate bigness. We have, by a number of indicators, higher concentration. We have the rise of these technology companies that are very dominant, much in the way that Standard Oil was in its day. We have a wave of huge mergers. In fact, next week in a courtroom in New York City, there is going to be a lawsuit challenging the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint. A merger which, if it goes through, would reduce the United States from 4 national carriers to 3. So it's very much in the headlines, and so I think the timing is perfect to try and have a vigorous discussion about this. Thomas, I want to start with you, and I want to ask you first if you could lay out for the audience today the broad landscape of the state of market concentration in the United States today. What are the facts that we can all sort of agree on, and how it's evolved, and whether we in fact are more concentrated today in the United States, and how that compares to other countries?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So I'm just going to lay out a few facts for the discussion. The way we measure concentration is we look at an industry and we look at the market share of the leading firms, the top 4, the top 8. So if you look at these metrics, over the past 20 years, the average market share of the top 8 firms has gone up by about 8 percentage points. So typically an industry would have 35% would be the market share of the top 4, 8, and then that went up by about 8 points to say something like a bit more than 40%. That's true in services and in manufacturing. So that's the broad landscape. It's not true in every single industry, but it's true in the vast majority of industries. If you look at other regions, so I spend a lot of time looking at Europe. So Europe, the data is not as good as in the US, but the range of estimates is from a small decrease in concentration, either or it's flat or it's a small increase, but it's nowhere near the increase we see in the US. So I think that's kind of the first thing, that's the first fact. Now, the thing that's very important as soon as we talk about concentration is to understand that concentration in and of itself doesn't mean that something bad is happening, because you could have concentration roughly for 2 types of reasons. It could be that the leading firms are just getting better and better over time, and they're expanding, okay, and that's efficient. So it's possible, in fact, it's often the case that it's efficient to have very large firms in an industry. In that case, you wouldn't want to prevent these efficiency gains by preventing firms from being large. So there's lots of evidence around the world throughout history of large firms being efficient and having large market shares. So that's the efficient type of concentration. The inefficient type of concentration is when firms, either via lobbying to get the regulations they like, or by playing very aggressive games with potential entrants, rig the system to prevent entry in competition. Now that would also lead to concentration, but that would be a bad type of concentration. So then the game, if you want, for people like me who do research, is to tease out, do we have the more good type concentration or more of the bad type concentration? And I think the bulk of the evidence suggests that we've moved from dynamics that were more consistent with good type concentration in the 1990s to, in the 2000s, in recent years, dynamics that look more like the bad type concentration. So just to give you one example, good concentration should come together with fast productivity growth and lower prices. To give you one example, this is exactly what happened when Walmart expanded from the mid-80s to the late 90s. Okay? That came together with very fast productivity growth in the retail sector. Profits of Walmart were actually flat over time, the profit margins, and prices were going down. So when you see that as an economist, you're like, okay, that looks pretty good. On the other hand, if you see concentration and very high prices, like the prime example would be in the telecom industry in the US today, then you're very worried.
Nancy, what do you think? Do you agree broadly with that, and how would you expand on that? And secondly, how would you assess the state of antitrust policy and enforcement today? I mean, is it up to the task of dealing with some of the trends that Thomas described?
So let me take each of those separately because I think they're quite different. To some extent, this debate over concentration and what the facts are resonated very much for me in a recent Economist article about inequality, which the premise of which was we think we all know how much worse inequality has become, but the underlying facts may not be as they appear. And I think there's some of that going on in this concentration debate. There are a set of broad facts that I think that we could agree on. Maybe the most basic one of which is large firms in the economy within broad sectors seem to have grown. If we take the statistics that Thomas just shared with you, the top 8 firms now have about an 8% higher combined market share in many of these broad sectors. What do I mean by that? Something like food manufacturing, which would include everything from pet food to artisanal chocolates to bakeries to chicken processing to ethanol production, right? So a very broad sector. The largest firms each have expanded on average their market share by about 1 percentage point. I think when you frame it in that context, it makes you step back and say, is that alarming? Should that be alarming? If the top 8 firms have a combined market share of 40%, it tells us that on average there are 20 firms competing for businesses. So if these were true markets, I think that most economists who study industrial organization and competition would say it doesn't look to us like there's much room for alarm. If we had 20 different firms competing for our business as consumers, I think we would feel that we had a lot of choice. The problem is that these aggregate statistics don't tell us much about what's going on underneath that. And I think just as when you go to the doctor with a fever and the doctor is thinking about prescribing Tylenol, an advanced antibiotic, or doing an emergency appendectomy, you'd like the doctor to know more about what's causing that fever before she chooses one of those options. And I think that's a bit of what's going on in this debate.
So where would you come down on it? Are you worried or not worried about the degree of market concentration?
So honestly, I think that there are particular markets where there are good reasons to be concerned.
Such as?
I would say healthcare, where there's been an increase in concentration. Maybe that ties in with some of the antitrust enforcement questions. It's interesting, Thomas, when you raise telecom, and Greg had mentioned this trial next week to block the merger of Sprint T-Mobile to preserve 4 national competitors. What he didn't mention is that the plaintiff in that trial is not the United States government, the Department of Justice, which saw fit to issue a complaint that said it would be a disaster for competition if we reduced the number of national mobile carriers from 4 to 3. So it said going from 4 to 3 would be bad for competition, and then created this incredibly bizarre patchwork of what they call a remedy to try to allow the merger and then replace that competition with a kind of Rube Goldberg device involving Dish and services that Dish would buy from the new Sprint. I think but France is my understanding, which you provide as an example of a place where there hasn't not only are not high prices, but has been a lot of competition. Also has only 4 national facilities-based carriers.
Yeah,
right?
We went from 3 to 4.
Right. So they've got 4, but haven't seen, according to some of the statistics that Thomas provides, the same level of competition. He argues France has had much more competition in that space. I think that goes not to competition policy, but to a different set of regulatory issues that the United States considered and rejected. So I think it's a complex set of factors. The one thing I would say from my time at DOJ is I think that antitrust enforcement has been increasingly hobbled, both by the way the case law has evolved and by the way the agencies approach some of the particularly conduct concerns, behavior concerns, but also some of the mergers.
Doug, what do you think? Do we have a market concentration problem? And if so, what should we do about it?
I don't think we have a generic one, but I would echo some of the things Nancy just said, particularly hospital service areas. We have some places in the United States that are highly monopolistic, particularly rural areas. And people talk a lot about U.S. health spending, and they always bewail the price of prescription drugs. But if you want to figure out the spending, it's the doctors and the hospitals. And there's a real absence of competition in some of those places.
So let's turn to the policy side. You said that you think antitrust has been hobbled. What do you mean by that? And give me the report card on this administration's antitrust efforts, and what, if anything, would you do differently?
So broadly, I think there's been a 40-year trend toward laxer enforcement, and that's taken place. I'll take that in two categories. One is mergers. In the 1960s, through the 1960s and 70s, relatively small mergers would have been challenged, or were in some cases challenged. You have to do that ex post. Over time, we've raised the concentration threshold before the agencies tend to get alarmed. And so if we used to enforce, roughly speaking, mergers that would take 8 firms to 7 or 7 firms to 6, now we're more likely to enforce 4 to 3, or maybe not even until you get 3 to 2. And that, I think, is reflecting in part a misreading of the economic evidence on what the effect of merger-induced concentration is. It's even worse on the conduct side. So we talk about monopolization, the discussion about the tech sector and what kind of behavior firms are engaging in that sector, and could we bring antitrust cases? Let's just say, not even before we get to the Warren proposals to break up tech, which would be, if not impossible, extraordinarily difficult under current antitrust law. But just behavioral cases have become much more difficult for the agencies or for private parties to successfully bring. So predatory pricing standards have become all but unenforceable. Exclusionary behavior and monopolization behavior has become very difficult to successfully litigate a challenge. And I think that's what we need to change.
So you brought up big tech, and let me sort of expand on that point, because I think one of the few things on which, for example, Republicans and Democrats agree on in Congress is that we have a problem with big tech companies being too large. Are there things, Doug, I'll start with you, are there things specific to the nature of companies like an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google that make them more formidable as potential or actual monopolists? And if so, what's the solution?
So I guess I'd say a couple of things. First, since I'm imitating Jason Furman, I'll just point out that he chaired this commission in Great Britain that looked at this issue, and they came to the conclusion there's nothing inherent about this that leads to monopolies. There are scale advantages, certainly scope advantages. They're unique in some ways, but their recommendations did not go to the point where you say, well, we have to regulate them as public utilities because it's inevitable that they are going to be monopolies. I think it's important to remember, and we've seen other situations where, Microsoft being the leading example, where we sort of thought, oh my God, they have this inherent advantage, and it turned out not to be true, right? So I think history and some people who looked at it carefully would say, no, these are not definitely monopolies. There are, some areas in which people like Google are in fact dominant. So let's look at search. But that's not all Google does, and that's the interesting aspect of those platforms is that you get these sort of demand complementarities because people are searching. You can give ads to them because the ad's working. That people go there to search, and that's the unique feature then that allows them to get such scale. And I think that's something that's worth looking at pretty closely. For aficionados of theory, Robert Lucas wrote a paper on this in 1978. And said that the firms are going to get bigger because of the unique, scarce thing is entrepreneurial talent or things like the insights that Google had. And when you get that, you can combine it with a lot of capital and labor and get a big return on it. That's exactly what we've seen.
So when you take a company like a Google, which has like a 92% market share in search, or Facebook, which is like some similar share of social media, it's difficult for at least a consumer to feel like they really have a choice, right? Now, Google will say, oh, you're all one click away from another search engine, but as a practical matter, people don't click away. And that, in fact, because Google has become such a good search engine, the algorithm learns. The more people use it, the better the algorithm gets, the better the algorithm gets, the more people use it. And so this sort of, like, I think, leaves policymakers in a bit of a dilemma. And Thomas, I'd like you to actually address this because the Europeans and the Americans have taken a very different approach to how to deal with this, right? The Americans, with the case of when the Federal Trade Commission looked at accusations that Google was driving people towards their own advertising or their own platforms for people who were like searching for restaurants or stores. The Federal Trade Commission said, yes, they are preferencing their own sites, but that maybe that's anti-competitive, but it's also helping consumers, so no harm. But the Europeans took a very different approach on that.
Yeah,
and tell us where you come down on this. What's better for consumers, the European approach or the American approach?
Well, on the specific issue of tech, we need both. But I think it's very important to take a little bit of a step back here. Like, what Europe is doing today is pretty much what the US was doing in the 1990s, and it's not by chance. It's because at the time we set up the single market in Europe, we looked around, and 20 years ago, it was obvious to everybody that the one place on earth where you would learn about free market was the US. So the reason the European playbook is the way it is because it is more than influenced by the US circa 1990. And it goes way beyond just pure antitrust. Like, my favorite example is still the telecom industry. And I think one number should be in your mind. Like, all of you in the room, if you lived in London, Paris, or Berlin, your cell phone bill would be half, and your internet bill at home would be half as well. I don't mean 10%, I mean literally 50% less. Right? The average household in the US pays $68 per month to get broadband access. The average household in France pays 31. The average household in France has 5 providers to get broadband internet. The average household in the US has 1.5. Okay, and that's all because of regulations to try to encourage entry. And in the cell phone carrier, we had 3 pure oligopoly, very high prices, and they lobbied very hard to prevent entry. Brought a 4th one. That is, we forced them to have a 4th one that would be a new competitor. That's exactly what the US used to do. This idea is a very American idea. And then this competition brought prices down by 50% in 2 years. Okay, so that's what the Europeans have been doing. They've been doing it successfully in, I would call them plain vanilla industries, such as telecom, airlines, transport, energy, by the way, same thing. If you buy your gas or electricity in Europe, you have many providers to choose from. So all of these markets that are plain vanilla, we made them more competitive by essentially adopting the US playbook. Now we come to tech, which is a lot more complicated because it is more global and it's like the tools are not exactly adequate. And as Nancy was saying, there is stuff that Europe anyway couldn't do. Like, even if we wanted to break up Facebook, that's never going to happen in Europe because there is no reason to do it in Europe. There is no case for that. So the best you can look at for Europe is what works, what doesn't work. In the tech area, I mean, the plus side, you could say, where we try to protect data. So when California started doing its own version of data protection, they looked at the GDPR from Europe. That's good. It's still a very messy process, and it's not nearly optimal. So there is a lot to improve there, but we tried at least. And then the other thing we tried is to do something about market dominance, broadly speaking. But what we've learned is fines and this kind of process is very slow. So every time we went after market dominance by, say, Google, we ended up with a significant fine, but by the time this happened, the competitors were dead already. So if you want to learn from the European experience for the tech, right, then you learn that you need to be much quicker and a bit more creative in what you do. That would be my takeaway.
Nancy, what do you think? What should we do be doing, if anything, about tech company dominance?
So maybe I could take this in 2 parts. So first, I think that the competition policy enforcement regimes are less different, with one major exception, between the US and the EU than Thomas thinks. In terms of merger policy, I think the 2 jurisdictions are broadly very similar. Modulus, maybe I hold off the current administration, which seems quite at odds with even past Republican administrations. In behavioral and conduct cases like the Google case that Thomas mentioned, European law deviates from US law in a very significant way, which is that it has a clause that prevents what it calls abuse of a dominant position. That's not part of the longstanding U.S. antitrust canon. And so in the U.S., antitrust enforcers can't go after a company that's large in its market just because it doesn't like because it's charging high price or it's undertaking certain types of actions that would be fine if the company were smaller, but that we don't like if the company's big. And I think that's part of where, when there's been a divergence between what the European Commission is doing in competition against, particularly in the tech sector, most of that is coming through this channel we don't have available to us. I actually think that, as I just said, I think the competition policy is not that dissimilar. I think the difference in many of the examples that Tomas given really do come back to regulation.
Yeah.
And there, as he said, and as Doug has mentioned, I think it's quite fraught. I mean, when you think about regulating tech, it's an extraordinarily innovative sector. One thing that we know from a long history of regulation in the US is that regulatory apparatuses tend not to be particularly friendly or able to accommodate to rapidly evolving innovative sectors and often discourage innovation. And so I think we want to be quite careful that we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater if we think we need to move to regulation. I take GDPR as an example. So this is the data protection regulations. That improves consumer privacy protection, and I think it's outrageous that the US doesn't have anything to protect consumer privacy. On the other hand, if you're thinking about competition in this space, there's some recent work that suggests that those privacy regulations have made it more difficult for smaller firms to succeed or for firms to come into the market. So you're better on privacy, but you're maybe worse on competition. And that tension can recur across a whole set of regulatory decision making. So, and I'll move back to the investment incentives in a regulated environment as well. So I think one of the big reasons for the contrast between the US and some of the examples in telecom of prices in Europe is because a number of European countries, I think, have established regulations that require companies that own the wires to sell access to their wires at very low prices to virtual competitors. So that's what a lot of these virtual mobile network operators, mobile telephone companies are. If you set that price very low, it's a wholesale price for being able to, set up the Rose mobile telephone service and charge $15 a month to you because I can buy it from Tomas Wired Company at $10 a month. You're going to have low prices for consumers, but you might discourage investment in the facilities that provide that access. And I was intrigued a couple weeks ago when, in an entirely different context, a panel on China, somebody said, well, try getting a 4G wireless signal in Paris, and I thought, or in France, and I thought, what does he mean by that? So I know the examples of of mobile plan prices being much lower, but when I went to a site that tries to determine what fraction of the time a user has access to a 4G signal, it turns out in the United States, that's 90% of the time that you're on your network, you can get 4G. In the US, in France, that number's 68%. And that maybe, I don't know enough about the industry in France, but maybe that's reflecting this kind of differential investment in quality. And so we have to be a little bit careful when we just compare prices, that there's not some hidden quality differential.
Doug?
So a couple of things. I was going to make the point about the compliance costs of the GDPR, which are really quite high. Some firms would argue you literally can't comply with it, but it is a barrier to entry, and I do think we need to worry about that. On the privacy front, one of the things that I forecast, I have lots of incorrect forecasts, this is one of my most recent, is that there was no question there would be privacy legislation in the US this year. It was something both sides agreed needed to get done. A preemption at the federal level for lots of state initiatives seems to make some sense. And it hasn't happened because it turns out to be incredibly complicated. And here's a flavor of it. One of the things that Jason's commission suggested is essentially allowing data mobility. So you have a package which is your data and you get to take it from Google and go give it to someone else or take it from Facebook. And this would be a way to engender entry and competition. So the question then becomes, what is data? And if you sort of think about your interaction with Google, for example, there's basically some offered data. I have a name, birth dates, all that stuff. You offer that up and identify yourself. There's a bunch of observed data, which is your interactions with the sites. What kind of searches did you do, things like that. And then there's some inferential data. What have they learned about you and the way you will react to certain incentives? Which data is mine? In fact, a lot of the data that's important is actually created during the interaction with the site and is a joint product. And what these privacy legislation really is about is assigning property rights to the data. And you can do that wrong and actually really blunt investment incentives and stop the innovation. And I think this is going to be tough to get right. I think it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point, which is we know these things are messy, and therefore the only way to do it is you try, and then you try to fix it. And I think there is no way that the Europeans are going to get it right by themselves. But you can also learn from what they've tried, and I agree with you. Like by far the biggest issue with GDPR is it creates barrier to entry, because the compliance costs are high enough that actually it's a boost to Google and Facebook because they have the means. So that's clear. That's the main downside. And the upside is that it has lots of ramification outside tech, by the way. One of the biggest implications of GDPR is it made the banking system much more competitive. Because now that you have the principle you own your data, you can share your data, which is all your credit history, with whoever you want, including a bunch of fintech, which is now why we have open banking working very well in the UK and France and various countries where fees are going down for basic banking services. So that's also
but that's
thanks
not
to
GDPR, is it?
It's GDPR together with the
No, the UK's got an incredibly complex regulatory system in the fintech space.
But the big change was GDPR together with the Payment System Directive. Because together, that meant that we could tell the banks they have to create an API so you can share your data. You can push your data to like a fintech provider to aggregate your account and give you advice about asset management.
Right, but
that was a big change. But that was the principle behind it, the motivation for doing that was the fact that you own your data, not your bank. That's just an example of like one side effect. So I think that's the point, which is this thing is so complicated and messy that it's going to have a ramification and costs, and you just need to learn what's the best way to do it. And I think that neither the US nor Europe alone could do it correctly. And I think if you learn from each other, there's a chance you're going to have something that works.
Well,
before we go on,
we're
just
agreeing more than anything else, because the great policy fight of 2001, 2, 3 was network unbundling for the telecoms, and we decided it was a bad idea. It was exactly what it was hurting investment incentives.
I want to just interject here. You all have a question card, by the way, at your seat. So we're going to move to Q&A in about 10 minutes. So if you have a question, please write it down on that, and we will have staffers coming around picking them up, and they'll bring it up to the front. I want to stick with the tech question for a moment, Thomas. Now, to what extent? Somebody who was skeptical of breaking up big companies would say that there are many supposed monopolists who've ended up not being so monopolistic. So we used to think Yahoo had monopoly in search, but then it crumbled because Google came along with a better one. We used to think MySpace would have all these network effects of social media until Facebook came along and turned out to be a lot better. Microsoft used to have a monopoly in desktop operating systems and application software, and now nobody thinks that they're nearly as formidable as they used to be. Does this history suggest that we can rely on market forces to bring down these monopolistic or market-dominant companies?
Yeah, so that's the big question. Can you trust that the market itself is going to self-correct? I think the history is mixed. I think what is always true is that all of the monopolies, even you started talking about Standard Oil. If you look at the history of Standard Oil, it was an amazingly innovative company. They pushed productivity. Like the reason they became Standard Oil is because they innovated a lot, actually. It was not just some fat monopolies that did nothing. They got there by being super innovative. Now, at some point, they become very large, and then what do you do? By the way, I think the same thing happened with Walmart. Look at the growth of Walmart. They got to the point, early 2000, we're like, wow, they are so dominant in retail. That's a big issue. If Amazon didn't show up, maybe we would be discussing, should we break up Walmart? Now, Amazon showed up. So I think it's mostly random. And you can't just make a prediction that's going to be universally true. Sometimes you're going to have a competitor like Amazon showed up right at the right time to compete with Walmart. And so now you have this duopoly, which I think looks pretty competitive to me. So I'm not too worried, to be honest. And some other cases, it doesn't happen. If you look at the data, so to me, there are two statistics that I find worrisome that speak to this issue. The first one is Concentration itself, it's kind of, like the thing you can put in the headline because it's easy, but it's not, as Nancy explained, it's not like the right number to think carefully about these issues. One I like a bit better is turnover. So you can look at, try to define finely grained industry if you can, and then just figure out if the same firms are dominant over many years. Okay, because it's one thing that you have concentration today, but if it's not the same leader 5 years later, maybe it's fine. And this number has creeped up. So like today, the chance that if a firm is dominant today, it's still going to be the same firm dominant 10 years later, that's higher than it used to be. So that's one. The other one that I find worrisome is in the past, if you looked at where is a lot of money being made across industries, and you rank industries by the one with the highest profits to the lowest profits, and you look at entry rates of new firms 5 years after, or over the following 5 years, then you would have a very strong correlation. You would have much more entry by new firms in industry that have very high profit rates, which sort of makes sense. But now if you look at that fact over time, it used to be very true in the 70s and 80s, and since 2000, that correlation has been close to zero. That suggests that for whatever reason, it's not happening. Like you don't have this fundamental rebalancing of entry in very high profit margin sectors. So I think that's the thing that as of now, maybe something could be done, which is not going to happen automatically in the market.
In fact, a factoid I remember from Jason's report was that Facebook and Google both emerged from this kind of like, free-for-all where there were like literally dozens of search companies and dozens of social media companies, none of which stayed dominant for more than a few years. But Google and Facebook have both maintained their position now for almost a decade.
Yeah.
So we seem to have moved well past that point. And also, I know a lot of people say, well, look, Microsoft isn't dominant any longer, but then people would say that's because the Department of Justice spent 10 years suing them. They ultimately settled the case, but Bill Gates might have been tempted to go and crush, Yahoo or Google or some other company without the fear of a vigorous antitrust behind them.
Can I wait? So I think your observation that often these companies that we think of as inviolable, they're going to be in this position forever. If we look back through history, we do discover a lot of examples. AOL, for those of you who are old enough to remember, right? It was the internet, right? And now nothing. I think what's important for that, and it is, there are strong forces toward that, and as Thomas mentioned, they're not necessarily inevitable, but it often occurs. But I do think having a strong competition policy, as you just mentioned, provides the framework that allows that to happen more readily. So I think in the tech sector, we have these large platform companies that we're concerned about. I think there are very strong network effects in those. And so the competition is less about, as economists say, competition in the market, who's going to get a little bit bigger. It's more now competition for the market. Are we going to have a replacement of one firm with another? And I think for that to work, for the conditions to be ripe for that, first we need those large dominant firms not to be able to buy nascent competitors, potential competitors, threats that are just emerging on the horizon and could become the next, say, Facebook. And if we allow Facebook to buy those firms, then we miss out because they've now brought them inside and they're no longer a potential competitor. And I fear that some of that is going on in the tech space. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking that's saying, oh yeah, Facebook WhatsApp or Facebook Instagram or Google Waze, those are all examples of that. Hard to be completely confident, but I think we can say, particularly because, as I mentioned, courts have evolved to make it much more difficult to enforce some of the kind of antitrust law that we used to enforce. Potential competition is an example of that. The US judiciary is extraordinarily skeptical of potential competition merger cases. And so now it's almost impossible, maybe even impossible, to successfully block an existing firm from buying up a very small potential competitor that doesn't really have much market share. So that's the kind of thing where I think reinvigorating antitrust policy could make a big difference.
Thanks. By the way, we'll go to questions very soon. So if you have a question, if you've written it down, hold your card up and somebody will come and collect it from you. I want to move a little bit beyond the traditional antitrust issues and market concentration issues, which are about us as consumers, and talk about us as citizens, because there's another piece of this monopoly debate that's going on right now, which is that these tech companies aren't just potentially monopolizing our economic life, but they're monopolizing our democratic life, that they have become platforms of expression, and it is their decisions and their gatekeeping roles that determine who gets to express themselves. This, as you probably know, is one of the big sources of complaints of conservatives who believe that they are inordinately shut down because their opinions are not popular with the people who run these companies. I'll just discuss quickly an example that I wrote about, which was bail bond companies, for example, are very unpopular. They do something that a lot of us don't find very nice. They charge, by and large, very poor people who are in trouble with the law large sums of money so they don't have to wait in jail while they're awaiting their trial. And a lot of people feel cash bond is very bad. And so Google agreed and banned all bail bond companies from its platform, which is a problem because bail bond companies no longer have a way to advertise. They used to advertise in the Yellow Pages, but the Yellow Pages have been driven out of business by Google search. Now, like or don't like bail bond, it's legal. It serves some kind of a purpose. Is it right that one company, whether it's Google or Facebook, should allow its particular political or social values to determine who gets to advertise or who gets to speak? Does anybody want to address that first?
Oh, no, I'm not going first on that one. Are you kidding me?
How about you, Doug?
No, I don't think it's right. And we tried to give them a way to ignore whatever business interest they had in keeping certain things off the site. Right? That's something maybe their customers don't like seeing bail bonds ads, and so they have a business reason not to put it up there. By giving them this carve out in liability for opinions expressed on the site, not making the site liable, is a really important part of the architecture of how the social media world's developed in the United States. But I don't think it's worked out as the way it was intended, and that's something worth revisiting.
Nancy, this actually goes by the name of neo-Brandeisian, I think, antitrust theory, or hipster antitrust, some people say it, which is that antitrust shouldn't just focus on the traditional economic metrics like consumer welfare, but go beyond that. And it's the role of antitrust to tackle bigness in and of itself. What do you think? Is that a useful way of thinking about the role of policy?
I think not, for two reasons. I think first, there's been a set of proposals to expand the antitrust laws to be not about competition, but about kind of public interest. So any merger would not be judged by a standard of whether it reduces competition, but whether it's in the public interest. And behavior would be judged this way. And as you said, there's a very strong kind of anti-big theme running through it. And I think that creates a lot more danger for us than is maybe immediately apparent. So first I would point to the telecom space, where the Department of Justice and the Federal Communications Commission share merger review responsibility. Either one could block a telecom merger. The DOJ operates under a competition standard, and the Federal Communication Commission operates under a public interest standard. And what you have going on in many telecom mergers is interest groups coming to the FCC and saying, we'll drop our opposition to this potentially anti-competitive merger if we get some benefits from it. So could you tell the companies they can have their merger if they have to spend X billion dollars on building out rural broadband, on putting facilities in my state, if it's a state that's going to it. It's sometimes been described as an opportunity to come with your holiday shopping list and present it to the FCC. And I think that's, Thomas written about kind of regulatory capture and the consequences of that. I think that's a terrible recipe to introduce into the entire economy, which is what antitrust goes to.
I think that the neo-Brandeisian, perhaps you can, I mean, it's not very fair because none of us is really a believer in this, so I don't think we're giving you a fully representative sample of what's out there. But I think the argument would be that when firms have too much power, they just have too much power, period, and you got to do something about it. And now the question is whether you want to do it via antitrust or something else. And I think what we're all saying is doing it via antitrust sounds really like the third or fifth best, which is if nothing else, perhaps, but otherwise it's not the first thing you would do. But you have to consider that the alternatives are also very likely to happen, because if you look at the data, for instance, in some of my research, I tried to figure out why don't we see more entry of new firms or growth of new firms. And a good predictor of not seeing entry of new firms is past lobbying by incumbents and campaign finance contributions by incumbents. So now so then to be fair, if you could fix that problem by changing the lobbying, by making the regulators more independent from the lobbies, but that means giving them more money and more independence and less revolving door. And good luck doing that with the FCC. And then the other thing you could do is change campaign finance law. How likely is that to happen in the US today? I think it's zero, right? So then this more logical alternative, if you're worried about business excessive influence, this more sensible alternative to going after that, maybe they are not really on the table. I think that's why the neo-Brandesians are just putting all their cards on antitrust. I still believe it's a bad idea, but I think that's the logic.
But I'm not sure, and I totally agree with what you're saying. I'm not sure that the argument that says it would be really tough to get effective campaign finance reform, which I personally think is a tremendous contributor to this. So therefore, but it's easier to get fundamental antitrust reform that goes to a you just can't be big standard. I don't think that's any easier. So I think we should tackle. I think we should tackle the underlying problem rather than the symptom.
I agree with you.
Okay, we'll go to some questions now.
She was my professor, by the way, so it's biased.
That's right. Yeah. Well, you've passed your dissertation, right? So you don't have to worry about what are the consequences of concentration for labor markets, i.e. monopsony? Is it possible that lack of competition is leading to sort of inferior outcomes for workers, reduced wages in some markets or states, or even suppliers? Thoughts?
Yeah.
You were about that.
You want to go for, yeah.
So there's again a concentration literature in labor markets, which finds high correlations between employer concentration and lower wages. It's hard to infer causality there. So is this because in labor markets that have experienced an increase in employer concentration, it's because a large employer is shut down, so there's less labor demand, and that's reduced wages. It's also increased concentration. I think it's a little tough to know how much monopsony is contributing to that problem. But I do think there is an increased awareness by both the DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission that there has not been enough attention to the effect of mergers upstream, so either on labor, hiring labor and wages in labor markets, or on upstream suppliers. What's happening if insurance companies get to merge, and that's suppressing the prices that they're paying to healthcare providers. That's sort of an anti-competitive harm, just as hospitals merging and increasing the prices they charge downstream is an anti-competitive harm. So I think there's a recognition that we need to do more, and that the antitrust law is symmetric in that it is not only possible, but there have been successful cases that have been brought alleging this kind of upstream harm. Not so much in labor, that's relatively new, but there have been some particularly say in the healthcare setting where employers have used their market power to reduce nurses' wages in an anti-competitive fashion, and the DOJ has successfully brought challenges to that. So I think it's an important recognition that we need not just to be looking at prices that consumers pay downstream, but what prices are paid upstream as well.
In the labor market, there is some evidence that you have like no poaching agreements and non-compete agreements are more frequent than they used to be, and that mechanically they lower wages. I think what we don't know is whether that's a 0.5% story or a 1% story or a 2% story. My sense of looking at dividends, it's there, but I don't think it's a very, very large number for the aggregate economy.
I'll bring up one example that neither of you did, which is one of the arguments about Amazon's problem is that, for example, they're now the dominant third-party platform for selling. Now, 15 years ago, if you were a small a seller of like linens, you know, in a small town and you wanted a national presence, you would open an online store. Now you know that most people go to Amazon first to search for linens, and they will never come to your personal online store. And so in some sense, you're sort of, Amazon exercises monopolist power over those suppliers, and it doesn't show itself, it manifests itself as high prices to me as consumers, but as reduced profit margins and reduced income to the suppliers. Is that a legitimate concern? Is that something we should be looking at?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm not sure
what are
you
you
can
gonna-
I'm not sure you can get to it through antitrust.
No?
Right.
But doesn't that show that one of the problems with our antitrust system?
So again, if the reason that everyone goes to Amazon is because that's offering a service to consumers that's incredibly valuable, and so Amazon is then able to attract third-party sellers to its platform, we tend to think that if you've gained your market power or your market share by outcompeting alternatives, you're better than eBay, say, which would be an alternative way, that you're entitled to the fruits of your labor in that respect. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm just saying I don't think that antitrust has got a solution to that unless Amazon is doing something a step beyond that. So if it's engaging in kind of exclusionary behavior that makes it more difficult for those third-party marketplaces sellers to compete, that's potentially actionable. But
Actually, that
That
actually
would
takes
be a
it.
difference, by the way, I think, where
yes,
what
it's
Nancy was
yes,
saying
because
when
of
the law is
the
different.
dominance.
That's
between,
right.
between the
That's
EU
where
and
it
the
matters.
US, that's where that's an example where it would be different. In the US, it would be very hard to just go after Amazon just for that. In the EU, you could, and in fact, people are thinking about it right now. The burden of the proof, if you want, is a bit lower. If you can show that they have this massive dominance in the market for a platform for attracting third-party sellers, then that's enough to do an inquiry.
Now,
If the standard's consumer welfare, you don't care what happens in the supply chain. You see what?
no. I will
Right? I
disagree
mean-
with that. So we say the standards consumer welfare. Think of it as trading party welfare. I think the standards. No. In the sense that what Amazon is selling to the linen store is access to consumers. They're charging a commission for that.
Yeah.
And if they did something, if they engaged in anti-competitive behavior to be able to increase commissions.
If they did.
Yeah. But I'm just saying it's not that consumers don't pay anymore that is the issue, because you could go after them for the commission increase.
Oh, if they did that, yes. Okay.
Right. Now, I think part of the way, by the way, that platforms like Amazon might reinforce their market position, and this is something that while in the U.S. there have been very few cases in this space, I think there could be more, is if Amazon's contract says you have to charge the same price for your linens on the Amazon platform as you do in your online store.
These MFN clauses.
Right,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
right, most favored nations.
Yeah.
Then I think it would be challenging, given the legal environment. The courts are, as I said, pretty hostile to conduct cases. But I think there's a case to be made there.
This actually takes us very nicely to the next question, which is one of the neo-Brandeisian charges against Amazon is they're driving all their competitors out right now via predatory pricing, by underpricing them. And Wall Street is letting them by supplying them with all this capital to finance their losses because they're looking ahead to that point 10 years from now when they've driven everybody out of business and can raise their prices. What do you think of that? What is the state of predatory pricing in this country, and what, if anything, should we do about it?
So there are two different questions, and I will just go back to Thomas' example of Walmart and Amazon to say those are exactly the arguments that were made against Walmart. In some places still are, right? They come into a small, especially rural town, like the small town in Pennsylvania that my mom lives in, and they lower prices, and the existing bricks and mortar stores can't compete, and they leave. And that's competition. But it was alleged, well, it's predation because as soon as they get everybody else out, then they'll raise prices. Well, they haven't done that. And we've seen entry by Amazon into that space. So I think we have to be really cautious before we say, well, prices are going down, and so less efficient competitors can't survive. Therefore, it's anti-competitive. I mean, that is the competitive process. And I guess I worry about it, but I haven't seen the kind of analysis that would say, oh, it's clearly anti-competitive. they're not selling below cost as best
I think we
can
have,
tell.
it's a bit like the wage story. We have a few examples where they did it. The famous one is with the diapers.com story. But if you look at the big picture, it's not happening on a large scale. So the question is, when do you think it's become really a problem? I mean, they've clearly done it in a few cases. The question is, is it widespread enough that it's that you want to do something about it?
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. What do the panelists think of Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren's plans to unwind mergers, many mergers? Doug, start with you.
Her plans are all tied for last, in my view. So,
Why?
I think that she has made the case on big, like they're big. Anything big, I'm going to unwind, and that's not a compelling case, and that's not the standard we should have.
Wasn't she right about the banks?
She was not right about the banks. In what way was she right about the banks?
We had these big banks and we had a crisis as a result.
We didn't have a crisis because we had big banks. We had big banks involved in a crisis, and we had inadequate capital and a whole bunch of other prudential regulatory problems, but it had nothing to do with them being big. You need big banks. If you're going to have globally competitive firms, you're going to have banks that can provide them with the scale and the scope of those services. You cannot run a modern economy on little banks.
Either Thomas, Nancy?
Well, the question is how big is big, but I mean, I don't think you have a massive problem of size of banks today. Because by the way, they haven't grown since 2010. So I don't think that's not first order on my list of issues. I think, to be fair to, I think what Elizabeth Warren was trying to do is, I think there is what you want to achieve and then the way to get there. And if to get half of the way through, you have to say, I'm going to try to break them up, then maybe that's the way to start, knowing full well that, by the way, that's the same thing with Microsoft. Like, officially, the idea was to force them to split in, and that never happened. But you could still, well, that was still useful because it forced them to scale down some of their ambitions, left some room for some of the other guys, and that's why we have Google. Maybe Apple came back also thanks to that. So, so then it's, do you interpret the statement as literally, I want to do that, and that's the only thing I care about? Or is it, I'm giving you a direction, and then I know we're not going to go all the way to the end point. I think my main worry, to be honest, is more like, I think when people start lumping Amazon, Google, and Facebook in the same basket, I'm like, I don't think that makes any sense. They are very different businesses. And if you look at what they do, what they produce, what they bring to the economy, they are not the same. So you want to, I'd be careful in putting them in the same basket.
We're out of time, but it's been a really good discussion. Thank you very much, Doug, Thomas, and Nancy.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.